The 9,929th meeting of the Security Council is called to order. I should like to take this opportunity to pay tribute on behalf of the Council to His Excellency Mr. Evangelos Sekiris, Permanent Representative of Greece, for his service as President of the Council for the month of May. I'm sure I speak for all members of the Council in expressing deep appreciation to Ambassador Sekiris and his team for the great diplomatic skill with which they conducted the Council's business last month. The provisional agenda for this meeting is the situation in the Middle East, including the Palestinian question. The agenda is adopted. In accordance with Rule 37 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the representatives of Israel and Yemen to participate in this meeting. It is so decided. I propose that the Council invite the permanent observer of the Observer State of Palestine to the United Nations to participate in the meeting in accordance with the Provisional Rules of Procedure and the previous practice in this regard. There being no objection, it is so decided. The Security Council will now begin its consideration of item 2 of the agenda. Members of the Council have before them document S/2025/353, the text of a draft resolution submitted by Algeria, Denmark, Greece, Guyana, Pakistan, Panama, the Republic of Korea, Sierra Leone, Slovenia, and Somalia. The Council is ready to proceed to the vote on the draft resolution before it. I now give the floor to those members of the Council who wish to make statements before the vote. I give the floor to the representative of Slovenia.
Thank you, Madam President. I have the honor to speak and introduce the resolution on behalf of the 10 elected members: Algeria, Denmark, Greece, Guyana, Panama, Pakistan, Republic of Korea, Sierra Leone, Somalia, and my own country, Slovenia. The resolution before us was, as on previous occasions, prompted by our deep concern over the catastrophic situation in Gaza, which deteriorated further after the resumption of hostilities in March. We have heard numerous briefings in this Council, from those of the Secretary General and USG Fletcher on the broader humanitarian situation, to those of people working on the ground. We are also seized of the daily briefings provided by the UN system and the humanitarian community, and follow closely the deeply disturbing reports coming from the ground, including in relation to the functioning of the newly established aid distribution centers. We continue to fully support the ongoing diplomatic efforts by the United States, Egypt, and Qatar aimed at achieving a return to the ceasefire deal. We firmly believe that this Council must also act urgently and decisively to address the humanitarian situation in Gaza in accordance with its mandate for the maintenance of international peace and security. The resolution before us is a product of consultations among all Council members. We thank delegations for their constructive engagement and flexibility that has allowed us to develop a text that responds to the catastrophic humanitarian situation in Gaza. We believe this text reflects the consensus shared by all Council members that the war in Gaza has to come to an immediate halt, and all hostages must be immediately and unconditionally released, and civilians in Gaza must not starve and must have full and unimpeded access to aid. It is for this reason that we have prepared a concise draft humanitarian resolution expressing grave concern over the situation in Gaza, including the risk of famine, and reaffirming that all parties must comply with their obligations under international law. It further expresses support to the efforts of mediators to immediately bring parties back to implementing the ceasefire agreement in line with Resolution 2735 of this Council. Importantly, the resolution also demands an immediate, unconditional, and permanent ceasefire in Gaza, respected by all parties. It also recalls the demand of the Council for immediate, dignified, and unconditional release of all hostages held by Hamas and other groups. The draft also contains an unequivocal demand for the immediate and unconditional lifting of all restrictions on the entry of humanitarian aid into Gaza, its safe and unhindered distribution at scale, including by the UN and humanitarian partners throughout the Gaza Strip, as well as the restoration of all essential services in line with international humanitarian law, the humanitarian principles of humanity, neutrality, impartiality, and independence, and the relevant resolutions of the Security Council. Madam President, on behalf of 10 elected members, we ask all delegations for their support for this urgent demand in line with this Council's responsibility for the maintenance of international peace and security. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Slovenia for his statement, and I give the floor now to the representative of the United States.
Thank you, Madam President. Colleagues, the U.S. opposition to this resolution should come as no surprise. It is unacceptable for what it does say, it is unacceptable for what it does not say, and it is unacceptable for the manner in which it has been advanced. The United States has been clear. We would not support any measure that fails to condemn Hamas and does not call for Hamas to disarm and leave Gaza. In recent months, Hamas has rejected numerous ceasefire proposals, including one over the weekend, that would provide a pathway to end this conflict and release the remaining 58 hostages. We cannot allow the Security Council to reward Hamas's intransigence. After all, it was Hamas who started this brutal conflict on October 7th, 2023, when Hamas perpetrated the worst massacre of Jews since the Holocaust. Hamas has sustained it ever since in a manner that threatens Israel's security and prolongs Palestinian anguish. It is Hamas that continues to threaten Israelis and puts Palestinian civilians in Gaza in harm's way every day, using them as human shields. They have brutally suppressed those brave enough to challenge its despotic rule. It is inexplicable that many members of this council still refuse to acknowledge that Hamas could end this conflict tomorrow by surrendering and laying down its arms. It is unconscionable that the UN still has not labeled and sanctioned Hamas as a terrorist organization. In addition to refusing once again to condemn Hamas for the cowardly and evil acts that set this brutal conflict into motion, this resolution contains other serious defects. The United States has taken the very clear position since this conflict began that Israel has a right to defend itself, which includes defeating Hamas and ensuring they are never again in a position to threaten Israel. In this regard, any product that undermines our close ally Israel's security is a non-starter. This resolution would undermine diplomatic efforts to reach a ceasefire that reflects the realities on the ground and emboldens Hamas. This resolution also draws false equivalence between Israel and Hamas, which is both wrong and dangerous. This resolution seeks an, and I quote, immediate, unconditional, and permanent ceasefire, close quote, that would leave Hamas in a position to carry out future October 7th attacks, as it has promised. This resolution refuses to acknowledge the disastrous shortcomings of the prior method of aid delivery, which allowed Hamas to enrich itself at the expense of Palestinians and failed to get food and water to those who needed it most. No one wants to see Palestinian civilians in Gaza go hungry or thirsty. We instead urge the UN and NGOs to support the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation to help it safely deliver aid without being diverted by Hamas. The GHF has emphasized it will deliver aid consistent with the humanitarian principles of humanity, neutrality, impartiality, and independence. Colleagues, we've been clear that in order to move forward, Hamas and other terrorists must have no future in Gaza. As Secretary Rubio has said, if an ember survives, it will spark again into a fire. This Council should use its power to pressure Hamas to accept the proposal on the table. Only after the terror group's removal can Israel be secure within its own borders, and can Gaza advance toward a brighter and more prosperous future. The United States has worked tirelessly with Egypt and Qatar to bring an end to this horrific conflict for the sake of the region's people. They want a path forward with opportunity and the prospect of a better tomorrow. Israelis yearn for a future where they aren't threatened by daily rocket barrages and other acts of terrorism. Palestinians deserve an opportunity to rebuild their lives, free of Iran and the influence of its insidious terrorist proxies. Rather than push forward a resolution that unjustly rewards terrorism, undermines negotiations, and allows Tehran to continue fomenting instability, let's instead demand that Hamas surrender, disarm, and leave Gaza forever, for the sake of all the region's people. Moreover, we need to be perfectly clear. Performative actions in this Council designed to draw a veto, as evidenced by the process of formulating this resolution, wherein there was no true negotiation, are harmful at a time when there is delicate diplomacy going on in the region to reach a ceasefire. Further, engaging in this performative process at a time when serious questions are being asked about the utility of the UN, its funding, and use of resources is shameful. This Council should not be used in this way. This Council must hold itself to a higher standard. Meanwhile, we've had our negotiators on the ground trying to hammer out a real agreement to get hostages released, get a ceasefire, and provide humanitarian assistance. Finally, the United States will never stop working to free all the hostages, including the remains of 4 Americans murdered by Hamas, who have now been held in squalid conditions for 607 days. They will not be left behind. Thank you.
I thank the representative of the United States for her statement. I shall put the draft resolution to the vote now. Will those in favour of the draft resolution contained in document S 2025/353 please raise their hand? Those against? Abstentions? The result of the voting is as follows: 14 votes in favour, 1 vote against, 0 abstention. The draft resolution has not been adopted owing to the negative vote of a permanent member of the Council. I now give the floor to those members of the Council who wish to make statements after the vote. I give the floor to the representative of Algeria.
Madam President, at the outset, we express our warmest congratulations to Guyana for assuming the presidency of the Council during this month. We want to commend also the Greek efficient presidency of the Council during the last month. Madam President, during our last meeting held on the 20th of May, I spoke with length of Dr. Ala al-Najjar. Remember, the mother whose name is now imprinted in the wound of every Palestinian soul. 9 of her 10 children were taken, not by fate, but by the deliberate fire of the Israeli occupying army. Remember, I asked then if her husband, Hamdi, awakens, what we shall tell him. Today we know he will never speak again. He will never hear again. He is gone. Dr. Hamdi succumbed to his wounds last Sunday. And that unbearable question will never cross his lips, nor Allah will bear the agony of answering it. And now, the last surviving is Adam, a 10-year-old suspended between life and the memory of what once was a happy family. We pray he recovers. We pray that he becomes a balm to his mother's shattered heart. Madam President, there are moments when silence is more eloquent than language. Today is one of those moments. But silence cannot defend the dead. It cannot hold the hand of the dying. It cannot confront the machinery of injustice. So we must speak loudly, not for the sake of mere stating position, but for the sake of memory, of morality, and of the human spirit. This meeting of the Security Council, this humanitarian resolution, even in its obstruction by a veto, is a mirror that reflects the agony of multilateralism and the urgent need to revive it. Today, the elected members of the Council have stood with clarity, with conviction, with courage. They are the proud bearer of moral legitimacy. They are the true compass of the world's conscience. The draft resolution that was halted today was not the voice of a few, but the collective will of the entire world, north and south, east and west. 14 out of 15 Security Council members. It was a message to the people of Palestine. You are not alone. You are not alone. And it was a message to the Israeli occupier. The world watched you. The shield of impunity, of immunity, must fall. It reveals why the Israeli occupiers continues its crime. Because it has never fully fared justice. Because it has always felt protected. While the victims were buried with no names, no headlines, no reckoning, no investigation, and no accountability. Madam President, for the killing of children, for the killing of Palestinian children, to not become a mere pastime, the Council should have acted to impose a ceasefire in Gaza. For the starvation not to be legitimized as a weapon, the Council should have acted to impose a ceasefire in Gaza. For the future generations to not grow up scorning international law, the Council should have acted to impose a ceasefire in Gaza. Madam President, today's vote is not a conclusion. It is another prelude. It is another beginning. As President Abdelmajid Tebboune has affirmed, Algeria will not abandon Palestine. We have stood with it in its pain, and we will stand with it in its resurrection. We will return to this Council again and again. We will return for the children who died before they knew what childhood meant. We will return for the women forced to give birth on roads lined with rubbers and flame. We will return for the fathers who built homes with bare hands, only to watch them collapse in seconds. We will return for the starving who refuse to trade dignity for bread beneath siege. We will return for the thirsty, killed for looking for clean water. We will return because the Palestinians deserve to live in freedom, in dignity. We are not tired. We are not resigned. We will come back, and soon. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Algeria for his statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Denmark.
Thank you, Madam President. Madam President, this week we surpassed yet another painful milestone. 3 months since Israel imposed grave restrictions on humanitarian aid entering Gaza. While this Council has been briefed time and time again of the cost of inaction, the risk of famine has continued to grow. As always, it is civilians who suffer the most. We've all seen the chaotic scenes at the recently set up aid distribution sites, and we deplore the killing of civilians trying to get life-saving aid. We've seen the sheer desperation, the human cost of months of severe restrictions on humanitarian aid. Madam President, Denmark voted in favor of this draft resolution. We co-penned it together with the elected members of this Council because we believe that it is time for this Council to speak with one voice, to take decisive action to address the catastrophic humanitarian situation in Gaza. We regret that it was not possible today. Around this table, we've been entrusted with the responsibility to maintain international peace and security. We cannot stand by while this relentless suffering continues to unfold in real time in front of our eyes. We need to act, to show leadership, and to deliver on that mandate. Madam President, this resolution contained 3 necessary demands: demand for an immediate, unconditional, and permanent ceasefire, demand for the immediate, dignified, and unconditional release of all hostages held by Hamas and other groups, and demand for the immediate and unconditional lifting of all restrictions on the entry of humanitarian aid into Gaza. Denmark wholeheartedly supports and reiterates these demands. International law is clear. Humanitarian aid must never be politicized and used as a political bargaining chip or as a part of a military strategy. It must flow freely and safely to all those in need, in line with international humanitarian law and the humanitarian principles. Madam President, we are under no illusions. This draft resolution was not perfect. Denmark regrets that the draft resolution did not condemn the heinous terrorist attacks by Hamas and other terrorist groups on October 7th, and we reiterate our firm condemnation of Hamas' despicable acts. It does not change, however, our support for the resolution as a whole, which we had deeply hoped would be adopted today. We thus remain resolute in our call for an immediate and lasting ceasefire, the immediate and unconditional release of all hostages, and for an urgent lifting of all restrictions on humanitarian aid. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Denmark for her statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of the United Kingdom.
Thank you, President. The United Kingdom voted in favour of this resolution today because the intolerable situation in Gaza needs to end. We are determined to see an end to this war, secure the release of the hostages held by Hamas, and alleviate the catastrophic humanitarian situation for Palestinians in Gaza. This Israeli government's decisions to expand its military operations in Gaza and severely restrict aid are unjustifiable, disproportionate, and counterproductive, and the UK completely opposes them. The Israeli government says it has opened up aid access with its new system. But Palestinians, desperate to feed their families, have been killed as they try to reach the very few aid sites that have been permitted by Israel. This is inhumane. We support the UN's call for immediate and independent investigation into these events and for perpetrators to be held accountable. Israel needs to end its restrictions on aid now. Let the UN and humanitarians do their job to save lives, reduce suffering, and maintain dignity. President, we regret that the Council was unable to reach a consensus today, but we remain committed to the vision of this text. We will continue to strongly support the efforts led by the United States, Qatar, and Egypt to secure an immediate ceasefire in Gaza. A ceasefire is the best way to secure the release of all remaining hostages and achieve a long-term political solution. And we repeat our condemnation of the heinous attack by Hamas on the 7th of October and demand that it release all the hostages immediately and unconditionally. Hamas can have no role in the future governance of Gaza. A two-state solution is the only way to bring the long-lasting peace, stability and security that both Israelis and Palestinians deserve. We welcome France and Saudi Arabia's leadership in chairing an international conference later this month. Thank you.
I thank the representative of the United Kingdom for her statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Pakistan.
Thank you, Madam President. It is a sad day, another low in the history of this august body that is entrusted with primary responsibility for the maintenance of international peace and security. Pakistan deeply regrets the failure of this Council to adopt the draft resolution tabled by the 10 elected members, and which was an effort to address one of the most grave and sustained humanitarian catastrophes of our time. Once again, the elected members have shown that they are here, ready and willing to fully assume the responsibilities that have been entrusted to them by being members of this Council on behalf of the general membership. Madam President, we are appalled that this Council once again stands immobilized in the face of mass suffering, atrocity, and unfolding tragedy. The veto cast today sends an extremely dangerous message that the lives of over 2 million Palestinians, besieged, starved, and relentlessly bombarded, are dispensable. This will remain not only a moral stain on the conscience of this Council, but a fateful moment of political abdication that will reverberate for generations. We have heard yet again the familiar refrain that this is not the right time and that space must be given to ongoing negotiations. But how much more space do we need? Space filled with rubble, graves, and the anguished cries of children. How much more time do we need? What amount of evidence do we need before we say enough and put to stop this barbarity and savagery perpetrated under a brutal occupation? While this Council deliberated and delayed, Gaza has been decimated. This is no longer a humanitarian crisis. It is a collapse of humanity and of international law and all that this Council is supposed to stand for. As the President of the ICRC noted, Gaza is worse than hell on earth. Over 54,000 civilians have been killed, among them 28,000 women and girls, and 18,000 children. In the last 24 hours alone, nearly 100 Palestinians have been killed and more than 400 wounded. Entire neighborhoods lie in ruin. Famine stalks the land. Disease and despair now spread more quickly than any aid can arrive. And while Gaza bleeds and this Council has been muzzled, the world has spoken. The International Court of Justice has issued binding provisional measures. The General Assembly has adopted numerous resolutions. The United Nations, humanitarian organizations, global civil society, people on the streets across the world, and increasingly voices from within Israel itself have recognized that what is unfolding is not merely war, but the systematic destruction of a people, war crimes, genocide. Madam President, in one of the most chilling developments, Palestinian civilians have been shot and killed while attempting to access food. And we think that to kill innocent civilians for seeking bread and water is not only a war crime, it is a tragic indictment of a system that criminalizes survival and militarizes humanitarian aid in flagrant violation of international humanitarian law. Aid dropped from the sky or delivered under armed escort is not a solution. It is a spectacle. And to defend these arrangements is not pragmatism. It is a moral failure. It is totally unacceptable. The draft resolution before us today was objective, balanced, principled, and rooted firmly in the UN Charter and the most basic tenets of humanitarian law. It asks for no more than what any human being deserves: food for starving children, medicine for the wounded, shelter for the displaced, the right to life, an end to killing, therefore. And it also asks for the release of the hostages. And it is also supporting the efforts that are underway to bring about a ceasefire. That even such modest, urgent demands could not pass underscores the depth of this Council's dysfunction. Let us be clear. This failure will not go down in records as a mere procedural footnote. It will be remembered as a complicity, a green light for continued annihilation, a moment where the entire world was expecting action, but yet again this Council was blocked and prevented by one member from carrying out its responsibility. Pakistan reaffirms its unwavering support for the Palestinian people in their just struggle for dignity, justice, and self-determination. We reiterate our calls for an immediate, unconditional, and permanent ceasefire, full, unfettered humanitarian access, and an end to the inhumane blockade of Gaza. A just, lasting, and comprehensive solution to the question of Palestine, rooted in international law and based on the establishment of a viable, contiguous, and sovereign Palestinian state on pre-1967 borders with Al-Quds al-Sharif as its capital in accordance with relevant UN resolutions. History will judge how each member of this Council chose to respond at this hour of moral reckoning. Together with the majority of the Council members, Pakistan stands firmly on the side of humanity, of legality, and justice. We urge the holdouts to do the same before Gaza becomes not only a wound on the world's conscience, but a permanent scar on the credibility of this Council. And President, but we don't end here. We're not going to lay idle. We are going to continue and redouble our efforts for the cause of peace in line with our responsibility as a responsible member of this Council. We will continue to call for accountability and an end to impunity that Israel, the occupying power, continues to enjoy. We shall continue to recall and remind that the root cause of the problem, the challenges confronting the region, is the decades-long illegal Israeli occupation of the Arab lands, including the occupied Palestinian territories. The way forward, in our view, is in addressing and tackling that root cause head-on. that is by ending the occupation. It is not by mercilessly and mindlessly killing the Palestinians, who are the oppressed people in this case, or by making them starve, or by trying to evict them from their lands, or by suppressing their voice, or by denying them their legitimate and internationally recognized right to self-determination. Because we know that that's not going to work. For the brave, dignified, and resilient people of Palestine are not going to give up. They're not going to give up their right, and they're not alone. The entire international community is on their side. That support is going to be evident later this month at the General Assembly, not this Council, but at the General Assembly, where the international conference, the high-level conference on Palestine and the two-state solution is going to be held. And we are certain that it will be a resounding call for the Palestinian rights and irreversible path to two-state solution and Palestinian statehood and full membership of the United Nations. We shall revert to the Council as and when required, as has been said by the distinguished representative of Algeria, and we expect that the Council will shoulder its responsibility towards Palestine and in the interest of maintaining peace and security in the Middle East. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Pakistan for his statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Somalia.
Thank you, Madam President. At the outset, allow me to congratulate you, Madam President, on your assumption of the presidency of the Council this month. I also commend the leadership of the Greek presidency in the able manner they have guided the Council's work last month. Somalia has voted in favor of the draft resolution presented today. We express our sincere appreciation to all Council members who supported this timely and important resolution. This short and concise resolution addresses the long-standing catastrophic humanitarian situation in Gaza. It demands an immediate, unconditional, and permanent ceasefire and the immediate and unconditional lifting of all restrictions on humanitarian aid. As we are all aware, the humanitarian situation in Gaza continues to deteriorate rapidly. Civilians are dying, in particular, women and children, from acute shortages of food, water, and essential medical supplies. The risk of famine is growing day by day, and entire communities are on the brink of collapse. We have all heard the many alarming briefings by the Secretary General and humanitarian community on the ground. The international community must not turn away from this unfolding human tragedy. Somalia regrets that despite the overwhelming support for this purely humanitarian resolution, the Council was unable to reach consensus. We underscore that the resolution's aim was solely to alleviate the immense suffering of civilians in Gaza and to ensure full, safe, and unhindered humanitarian access in line with international humanitarian law and humanitarian principles. Somalia remains firmly committed to continue its efforts together with Council members and the wider UN membership to support the Palestinians to exercise their inalienable rights to live in dignity and to govern their sovereign land and build the future of their children in an independent state with Al-Quds al-Sharif at its capital in line with UN Security Council relevant resolutions. We urge Israel as the occupying force to fulfill its obligation under international law to ensure that humanitarian assistance reaches those in desperate need without delay or hindrance, and to end its occupation of Palestinian land. This is the only path to sustainable peace in the Middle East and for the future of many children to come. I thank you, Madam President.
I thank the representative of Somalia for his statement, and I give the floor now to the representative of China.
Madam Chair, at the outset, let me congratulate Guyana on assuming the presidency of the Security Council this month, and Greece on successfully completing presidency of the Council last month. China is deeply disappointed by the result of today's vote. The draft resolution on the humanitarian situation in Gaza tabled by the E10 of the Security Council clearly calls for an immediate and permanent ceasefire in Gaza and lifting of the blockade on humanitarian supplies therein. These are the most pressing demands of the people in Gaza who are struggling amidst death and despair, and they reflect the overwhelming voice of the international community. The United States has once again abused its veto power, extinguishing the glimmer of hope for the people of Gaza and ruthlessly continuing to leave over 2 million people in darkness. It must face questioning from the international community. People cannot help but ask, where is fairness and justice? For more than 600 days, over 54,000 people in Gaza have lost their lives. Israel continues to escalate its offensive and blockade, turning Gaza into a living hell. Innocent civilians are killed in the conflict every day, while a large portion of the population is on the brink of famine. The United Nations has clearly pointed out that the aid delivery mechanism promoted by the U.S. and Israel violates the principles of impartiality, independence, and neutrality. Recently, there have been repeated incidents of civilian casualties near distribution sites, and this mechanism has even become a death trap. The brutal facts have clearly shown that military means are not the solution. This conflict has long exceeded the limits of a hostage rescue operation. Israel must immediately cease military operations and fully restore access for humanitarian supplies. People cannot help but ask, where is the international rule of law? Since the outbreak of the conflict, we have witnessed the weaponization of humanitarian aid, the targeting of civilian infrastructure such as schools and hospitals, and the ruthless killing of journalists and humanitarian workers. Israel's actions have crossed every red line of the international humanitarian law and seriously violated Security Council and General Assembly resolutions, as well as the provisional measures ordered by the ICJ. Yet, due to the shielding by one country, these violations have not been stopped or held accountable. Observing international humanitarian law is an obligation all parties must fulfill. It is not optional. Any double standards or selective application will only erode the foundation of international rule of law and must be firmly rejected. People cannot help but ask, where is the authority of the Security Council? As the primary body responsible for maintaining international peace and security, the Council has been striving to achieve a ceasefire in Gaza and has long reached overwhelming consensus on ceasefire and humanitarian issues. Today's vote result once again exposes that the root cause of the Council's inability to quell the conflict in Gaza is the repeated obstruction by the U.S., who has vetoed the Council's request for ceasefire multiple times. And because of its shielding of Israel, several resolutions adopted by the Council have not been effectively implemented. Claims that Security Council action would interfere with diplomatic efforts are completely untenable. As long as diplomatic efforts are genuinely aimed at peace, the actions of the Council will only provide strong support. Madam President, the international community will never cease its efforts to pursue fairness and justice, uphold the international rule of law, and safeguard the authority of the Council. A veto by a single permanent member cannot stop the march toward peace. We urge the U.S. to face up to its responsibilities as a permanent Council member abandon political calculations and adopt a just and responsible attitude in supporting the Council to take all necessary actions. China stands ready to work with the international community to help end the conflict in Gaza, alleviate the humanitarian disaster, implement the two-state solution, and ultimately achieve a comprehensive, just, and lasting solution of the Palestinian question. Thank you, Madam President.
Of China for his statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of the Russian Federation.
Madam President, we thank the elected members of the Council for the courage they have shown in their efforts to advance a very timely and useful draft resolution on which we had a vote today. We note in particular that the sponsors managed to, in a very short time, prepare a draft of a genuinely balanced and strong document which is aimed at an immediate and unconditional ceasefire, the release of all hostages, and the lifting of the humanitarian blockade from Gaza. In current tragic circumstances, that is the bare minimum, or even we can call it the first aid kit that the international community has to provide in order to ease the suffering of peaceful Palestinians. Unfortunately, yet once again, the Council did not arrive at an outcome acceptable to all, and it could not adopt the kind of product which would have spared Gaza and the entire region from sliding further into chaos. Yet another opportunity was missed to show that the Security Council is ready to shoulder its responsibility for maintaining international peace and security in the context of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, which has now lasted 8 decades. And I think that we all today had another opportunity to see who really wants peace in the Middle East and who wants to continue playing political games. Under current conditions, we place particular hopes on the upcoming, this month, high-level conference on the Middle East settlement, which is to take place in New York and to be co-chaired by Saudi Arabia and France. It's important to make sure that it has a concrete outcome and aims at breathing new life into the idea of a two-state solution. For that purpose, the international community needs to display collective will and do its utmost to make sure that conditions are created, the conditions which are needed to resume the peace process. And we intend to have a most active participation in the conference. I thank you.
Representative of the Russian Federation for his statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of the Republic of Korea.
Thank you, Madam President. For more than 600 days, especially since the breakdown of the ceasefire in March, Palestinian civilians in Gaza have been struggling to survive through the most unendurable hardships. We witness every day on our screens the agonizing killing of innocent Palestinians, including children, caused by incessant airstrikes and live fire. Denial and restriction to the life-saving aid, including food and medicine, are exacerbating the catastrophic situation in Gaza. We have seen the chaos and violence at the aid distribution sites since the new aid plan began its operations last week. We cannot support a scheme that does not prioritize the need of civilians, nor is underpinned by the principles of humanity, neutrality, independence, and impartiality. Madam President, we are also extremely concerned about the horrific conditions that Israeli hostages, still brutally held by Hamas, are forced to endure since the horrific terrorist attacks by Hamas on October 7, which we condemn in the strongest terms. But as we have witnessed for the last 3 months, blocking or throttling humanitarian aid for millions of people cannot ensure the safe return of hostages. Based on these deep concerns, the Republic of Korea participated with other elected members of the Security Council in tabling this draft resolution, demanding the immediate and unconditional lifting of all restrictions on the entry and distribution of humanitarian aid in Gaza. Today's draft resolution is not contrary to the steadfast and unwavering support of the international community, including the Republic of Korea, for the persistent efforts by mediating countries, the U.S., Qatar, and Egypt, to secure an immediate ceasefire and release of hostages. While it is regrettable that the draft resolution was not adopted today, we believe that its wide support proved again the position of the vast majority of the international community, unequivocally demanding unimpeded delivery of humanitarian aid to Palestinian civilians in dire need. Considering the urgency of the harrowing situation in Gaza, we desperately hope that the extreme suffering of the Palestinians in Gaza will end as soon as possible. I thank you, Madam President.
I thank the representative of the Republic of Korea for his statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of France.
Merci, Madame.
Thank you, Madam President. We all know the tragedy that's taking place under our very eyes in Gaza. Not very many words are needed. We voted in support of the resolution, and we thank the elected members of the Security Council for having prepared the draft. And we deeply regret the fact that it was not possible to adopt it today. The Council was prevented from shouldering its responsibility, despite the fact that most of us seem to be converging on one view. We reiterate our appeal for a permanent and immediate ceasefire. Providing humanitarian aid cannot be conditional on a ceasefire, nor can be used for political purposes. We call on the Israeli government to abide by its international obligations so as to make sure that humanitarian assistance is supplied immediately at scale, safely, and in unimpeded fashion to the people throughout Gaza. We reiterate for this purpose our support to the United Nations agencies and their humanitarian partners. They have shown their capacity to supply the assistance. All of the hostages have to be released without delay and without conditions. This resolution was asking for exactly that in a very firm way. We never stopped and will not stop condemning the terrorist attacks on the 7th October 2023 committed by Hamas, and the Security Council has to do the same unequivocally. Hamas has to disarm and cannot be part of the solution in Gaza. The Security Council should also, on the basis of agreed parameters, work towards a concrete implementation of the two-state solutions. Israel and Palestine, for the two people who have the equal right to exist, to security and to dignity. France will continue working towards these objectives by co-chairing, together with Saudi Arabia, the conference on the two-state solutions on the 17th to 20th June upcoming. I thank you.
I thank the representative of France for his statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Greece.
Madam President, in Gaza for several months now, we are witnessing a humanitarian crisis of massive proportions, which each passing day more Palestinians are at risk of dying, following thousands of deaths already. Reports clearly warn of an entire population at critical risk of famine. Hundreds face the risk of succumbing to the injuries, as hospitals have either suspended their operations or have been shut down. Amidst this grave condition, the elected members of the Security Council proposed a draft resolution that seek to address this very urgent situation. We strongly condemn the horrendous terrorist attacks perpetrated by Hamas and other terrorist groups on October 7, 2023. Today we echo the voices that call for the need to agree upon an immediate ceasefire and the immediate and unconditional release of all hostages. We appeal to Israel to allow the immediate, full, unhindered flow of humanitarian aid at scale into all parts of the Strip, as it is clearly dictated by international law. Access to electricity and water must be fully restored as well. Dialogue and coordination with the UN and its agencies remains critical in this regard. While we welcome the partial resumption of aid delivery into the Strip, it is hardly sufficient. At the same time, reports on loss of lives of people seeking aid are simply unthinkable. Madam President, peace cannot be attained by force. It can only be achieved by understanding. Both parties need to strive for a permanent and sustainable ceasefire. In view of the upcoming conference in New York under the co-presidency of France and the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, we look forward to revitalizing the political process with the ultimate goal of achieving a two-state solution in accordance with relevant Security Council resolution. In this way, both Palestinians and Israeli will finally be able to live side by side in peace and security. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Greece for his statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Sierra Leone.
Thank you, Madam President. Sierra Leone thanks Slovenia for coordinating the efforts of the 10 elected members of the Security Council on the draft resolution submitted for adoption before the Council today. We commend their dedication in steering the negotiations. We also acknowledge the engagement and flexibility demonstrated by Council members throughout the negotiation process. Sierra Leone voted in favor of the draft resolution out of a deep concern for the catastrophic humanitarian situation in the Gaza Strip. Our vote was also driven by the continued plight of hostages held by Hamas since the horrific attacks of October 7, 2023. The prevailing conditions, marked by suffering, hunger, insecurity, and death, paint a grim picture of the daily realities faced by Palestinian civilians in Gaza. We unequivocally condemn the brutal attacks on civilians around aid distribution sites that have led to numerous deaths and injuries. And we join the United Nations and fellow Council members in calling for an urgent, independent, and impartial investigation into these killings. Since the breach of the ceasefire by the government of Israel in March 2025 and the subsequent failure of the parties to reach a renewed accord, it was imperative for the Security Council, as mandated by the Charter of the United Nations, to take decisive action to alleviate the suffering of civilians. In this regard, we welcome the initiative of the E10, which reflects our own conviction that the Council must not remain silent. Tabling the resolution was a timely effort to allow the Council to speak with one voice in confronting the dire humanitarian crisis. It called for an immediate, unconditional, and permanent ceasefire and reiterated demands for the immediate, dignified, and unconditional release of all hostages held by Hamas and other armed groups. The draft resolution further reinforced the imperative for compliance with international law, including international humanitarian law, and called for respect for the principles of humanity, neutrality, impartiality, and independence in humanitarian action. We deeply regret, however, that the draft resolution was not adopted. While the text may not have been comprehensive, which was an intentional expedient decision of the pen holders, it represented the bare minimum required to address the worsening catastrophic humanitarian situation. We wish to emphasize that the occupying power, Israel, is bound by international humanitarian law, including the Fourth Geneva Convention and Additional Protocol 1, to ensure the Palestinian civilians access essential humanitarian assistance. We reiterate the binding obligations of the State of Israel under international law, including those arising from the provisional measures indicated by the International Court of Justice in the case brought by South Africa against Israel. These measures underscore the imperative to ensure unhindered access to humanitarian assistance for civilians in the Gaza Strip. Madam President, as emphasized in the draft resolution, Sierra Leone supports ongoing diplomatic efforts led by Qatar, Egypt, and the United States, and urges the parties to act in good faith and show maximum flexibility. The cost of inaction will be borne by an entire generation of Palestinian and Israeli children whose peace, fundamental rights, and future security are in jeopardy. We urge all parties to fully comply with previous Security Council resolutions, including 2712, 2720, 2728, and 2735. In closing, Madam President, Sierra Leone reaffirms its commitment to supporting genuine and credible political efforts to end this protracted conflict. A just and lasting peace, grounded in the two-state solution, must be earnestly pursued. This Council must remain resolute in discharging its responsibilities. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Sierra Leone for her statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Panama.
Gracias.
Thank you, Madam President. Panama congratulates Greece for its very skillful conduct of the Council's work during their presidency last month. And to Guyana, we congratulate you on taking over the presidency of the Council in June, and we wish you every success in your work. We also welcome with us the delegations of Israel, Yemen, and the observer state of Palestine. Panama deeply regrets that it was not possible to adopt the draft resolution introduced by the elected members of this Council. We are grateful to delegations for the collective leadership which made it possible to draft a balanced text focused primarily on alleviating the human suffering in Gaza. At the same time, we acknowledge the work of delegations which supported this initiative. Panama supported the text because it represented the lowest common denominator, the bare minimum that we should be able to defend, namely a ceasefire, safe and unhindered access to humanitarian aid, and the immediate, dignified, and unconditional release of all hostages. Above all, in view of the fact that alternative mechanisms that recently have been used to distribute aid to the civilian population have resulted, regrettably, in inefficiencies. They've led to frustration and they've been counterproductive. Nothing contained in this proposed resolution disregards the legitimate security concerns. It responded to the urgent need to save lives and to restore hope for those who are surviving in extreme conditions. Today, the Council missed an opportunity to send an urgent message, a message of humanity, who those who are crying out for relief, who are hanging by a thread to life in the midst of devastation, and to the wounded who do not have access to basic medical treatment, to displaced families who are living in the rubble of ruins in what used to be their homes, and to Israeli hostages who remain in captivity, and their families who live in anguish not knowing whether or not they will return, and to the humanitarian workers who, under gunshots and shelling, continue to do their work, and the innocent children who are experiencing a war like no other. In a world where there is bread and food, the people in Gaza live with death and destruction. They don't understand resolutions or vetoes. They only know despair and desolation. They're human beings, and it is our collective responsibility to protect them. Madam President, our inability to arrive at a consensus on a humanitarian issue should lead us to give greater thought to this issue. Panama is firmly committed to the principles of international humanitarian law and to the collective efforts to alleviate the suffering of the civilian population in Gaza. With that same firm determination, Panama once again reiterates its firm condemnation of attacks carried out cruelly by Hamas on the 7th of October 2023. as well as the detention of hostages in conditions which run counter to international humanitarian law. We call for the immediate, dignified, and unconditional release of all hostages who are still in the hands of Hamas, as well as the restoration of a permanent ceasefire, which will make it possible to protect the civilian population and facilitate full and safe access for vital humanitarian aid to Gaza. The civilian population cannot and should not continue to face this level of suffering. It is our responsibility to act. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Panama for his statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Slovenia.
Thank you very much, Madam President. And at the outset, let me join appreciation by you to the Greek presidency for the skillful way they conducted the presidency in May. And of course, we congratulate you and we extend our full support during your presidency. Colleagues, in an open letter published in a Slovenian newspaper this week, a Palestinian doctor described Gaza as a place where life slipped beyond danger and beyond hunger, into ashes and sorrow. As weeks and months have passed, the briefings we received in this chamber have become increasingly distressing. Just ashes and sorrow. Appeals and pressures from humanitarian organizations, civil society, the UN membership, and global public opinion for the Council to act have only intensified. With developments on the ground, our messages became stronger and sharper. At the last Council meeting on the Middle East, several members spoke of the Council's responsibility. It is weight of that responsibility, as an elected member of this Council, that led us to react in response to the tragic situation in Gaza. We extend our thanks to Algeria for initiating this process with the support of the Arab group. It was never our intention to provoke a veto. Anyone who has followed Slovenia's engagement in this Council will know by now that we have only one agenda: to unite, to build consensus, and to bridge divides. Our intentions have always been sincere. We were aware of different positions inside the Council. This is why the draft resolution had only one focus: a humanitarian one. We, the elected members, thought that the Council should unite around this urgent demand for unimpeded humanitarian access and for food to be delivered to starving civilians. Starving civilians and inflicting immense suffering is inhumane and against international law. No war objective can justify such action. We have hoped and expected that this was our shared understanding. Madam President, we continue to support the diplomatic efforts of the United States, Egypt, and Qatar to bring the parties back to the deal as stipulated in Council's Resolution 2735. We also support the convening of the International Conference on the Two-State Solution to be held by the General Assembly this month. However, the role of this Council in achieving peace in the Middle East is clear. It cannot be substituted, nor can it be delegated. A veto prevented the Council from taking action today. However, the resolution drafted by the members elected by the UN membership reflects the strong support of the membership for the efforts of the UN and its humanitarian partners to deliver aid to Gaza in accordance with humanitarian principles. Let them work. Faced with a choice between abandoning the rules that have guided the international community for the past 80 years and the veto, we chose humanity. as humanity has been tested in live stream from Gaza. This draft resolution emerged from our shared sense of responsibility. Responsibility toward Gazan civilians, toward Israeli hostages and Palestinian prisoners alike. Responsibility towards the wider UN membership, towards public opinion, towards humanitarian workers, and responsibility in front of history. The resolution was not adopted. 14 votes in favor, however, carries a strong message. Enough of civilian suffering. Enough of food being used as a weapon. Enough is enough is enough. Madam President, colleagues, we tried, we continue to try. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Slovenia for his statement. The representative of the United States has asked for the floor to make a further statement. I give her the floor.
Thank you, Madam President. President, I would like to respond to a disturbing comment made by a member. And I just want to reiterate that Israel has a right to defend itself. And it has taken numerous measures to limit harm to civilians and address humanitarian needs. The loss of civilian life in Gaza is tragic. We all mourn this. But the responsibility for this rests with Hamas, which could stop the fighting today by freeing the hostages and agreeing to the ceasefire terms already accepted by Israel. Blaming Israel and making spurious accusations of genocide is not only inaccurate, it is dangerous, not least because doing so buoys Hamas. I thank you.
I thank the representative of the United States for her statement. I now give the floor to the permanent observer of the Observer State of Palestine.
Madam President, I thank you for convening this meeting at the outset of Guyana's presidency of the Security Council and reaffirms our confidence in your skilled leadership of the Council. We thank all the elected members of the Council, the E10, and their coordinator, Slovenia, who introduced the draft on behalf of the E10. We thank them for bringing these demands forward and for their leadership over the last 20 months. We thank all those who voted in favor of the draft resolution, the 14th of you. We thank Algeria for mobilizing the Council with the full support of the Arab group. You've accomplished something. 14 votes in the Security Council is something very formidable. We appreciate that. We thank you. Madam President, this draft resolution had a simple goal: demanding a ceasefire that would allow the beginning of the monumental work needed to end the horrific humanitarian situation, to stop the genocide, to release hostages and prisoners, and to get the Israeli occupying forces out of Gaza before they get a chance to implement their plans to destroy our people. As they press on with the mass killing and forcible displacement of Palestinian civilians and theft of Palestinian land. The draft resolution also demanded an end to the engineered starvation that has brought an entire civilian population, 2 million people, among them 1 million children, to the edge of famine and then used aid to lure them and confine them to an extremely limited area of the Gaza Strip, clearly to facilitate their expulsion and annexation. OCHA has stated that Gaza is the hungriest place on earth. It is the only defined territory in the world where the entire population is at risk of famine. And OCHA added, the aid operation is one of the most obstructed aid operations, not only in the world today, but in recent history. End of quotation. Can this council say anything about that? You cannot even say something about that. Can this council act, as many of you have been saying, as demanded by the Charter that unify all of us to respect and honor the principles reflected and contained in that Charter, our Constitution? In the face of this open and ongoing threat to millions of human lives, those seeking life-saving aid to feed their children and themselves are being subjected to killing and degrading treatment and inhumane conditions, to a horrific degradation of life. This has to stop. It has to stop. Israel has to end this punitive, illegal siege. It has to open all crossings and allow aid to reach Palestinians throughout the Gaza Strip. The UN plan allows that. UN agencies and humanitarian organizations must be allowed to work to extend life-saving aid to all who need it. Let them work. Let them work. Let them get to their work, as has been stated by our colleagues. Israel is breaching the fundamental rules of international law, of basic humanity. The ICJ orders, in the case on genocide, the resolutions of the Security Council and of the General Assembly. Israel is committing war crimes and crimes against humanity. Can the Council say anything about that? Can you say anything before acting? The E10 and the demands reflected in the resolution, one would have hoped that these minimal demands that are dictated by humanity, by legality, by morality, would have received unanimous support. But unfortunately, they were faced with a veto. This draft resolution is long overdue. It came months after Israel broke the ceasefire and enacted a full-fledged blockade in humanitarian assistance, and not only resumed, but escalated its relentless killing of Palestinian children, women, and men, and its rapid destruction campaign across Gaza. It came after months of blatant, unapologetic, brazen Israeli violations of the resolutions of this Council, including Resolution 2735. All states represented here were hoping that the efforts of the US, Egypt, and Qatar would yield an immediate ceasefire to end this horrific war. But unfortunately, until now, that has not happened. Does that mean Israel can continue its destruction of the Gaza Strip and of all life within it while the negotiations continue? Does that mean it can starve people, the 2 million of them? That is an untenable and an unacceptable position. It should be rejected. It should not be allowed to continue. Madam President, we will be heading to the General Assembly in the coming days. But let us be clear. What can stop this genocide are immediate and real measures by states to deter Israel from prolonging this aggression against the Palestinian people and forcing it to stop the mad march it is embarked on across the occupied Palestinian territory. Let me repeat that measures by states, by the 14 of you, and by the dozens more, the almost 100 and maybe 60 who are in the General Assembly or more, measures by each and every one of you, as you demonstrate, and we are grateful for your demonstrations and tenacity in the Security Council in demanding action, and we also support you in continuing to knock on the door of the Security Council to shoulder its responsibility, but you can act in your national capacity. You don't need an invitation from anyone. You have tools available to you in your national capacity to make those who are making this miserable life of the Palestinian people in the Gaza Strip, killing them, starving them, forcing you all, forcing them to stop this crime against humanity. Yes, you can do it, and you have to do it. And I am sure you are on the verge, some of you will start first, of taking these steps to stop this crime from continuing to happen. And the brave ones who will take the first few steps will be followed by others. It has happened in the crushing of the abhorrent system of apartheid. It started with an employee in a grocery store in Ireland that led to a massive movement that spanned the globe to bring down that abhorrent system of apartheid. We are not exception to the rule. We see the marches everywhere. We see the support everywhere. We see your support and your loud and brave and principled position in the Council and outside the Council. But we need to get to the business of each and every one of you. You have tools, you have available things to you in order to pressure those who are refusing to listen to all of us, refusing to listen to international law, refusing to listen to provisions of humanitarian international law, refusing to listen to the UN, to the Secretary General, to Mr. Fletcher, and all the brave leaders in the United Nations. They need to be dealt with differently until they yield to our collective will that we will not tolerate, nor we will allow them to continue killing the Palestinian people and starving them as we see it in the Gaza Strip. This is what's ahead of us, and I am confident that you will elevate yourself to such responsibilities because you tried everything and now you are being forced to these extra steps that we are confident that you will. This is imperative to save lives and to finally bring an end to this abomination, this illegal occupation in every facet. Every country has an obligation to act. Act now. Act decisively. Act to end impunity. Act to end atrocities. Act for humanity. Thank you very much, Madam President.
I thank the permanent observer of the Observer State of Palestine for his statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Israel.
Mr. President, today this Council stood at a crossroads, and most of you chose wrong. You chose appeasement and submission. You chose a road that does not lead to peace, only to more terror. We thank the United States for standing on the right side, for standing on the side of truth, justice, and moral clarity. Thank you for refusing to abandon the hostages and for refusing to legitimize the lies of this resolution. Thank you for showing the bravery to say what so many seem too afraid to say, that Hamas is the obstacle to peace, and that spoiling terrorists only deepens the crisis. Colleagues, there is a real framework already on the table. It is a US-backed proposal constructed with Egypt and Qatar. Israel has accepted multiple versions of that proposal. We have accepted compromise after compromise. We have said yes repeatedly because we are prepared to do whatever we can to bring our hostages back home. Hamas has rejected every single version of that proposal, every deal, every offer, every opportunity. They have responded with silence or with new impossible demands. They have shown the world time and again that they are not interested in reaching an agreement. They are only interested in surviving and delaying a deal for as long as possible. So why does this resolution say nothing about that? I listened to all of you. You know, only a few of you actually mention a condemnation for Hamas. The rest, you forgot about that. Instead of confronting the truth, some on this council attempted to bury it. Instead of applying pressure where it belongs, on Hamas, you have applied it on the country actively working to bring its people back home. That is not diplomacy. That is surrender. And it sends a clear message to Hamas. Reject every deal, and the international community will still reward you. Hold innocent civilians hostage, and the UN will still give you legitimacy. Continue the war, and the pressure will still fall only on Israel, not on the terrorists who started this war. You know that Hamas does not care about the resolutions, what's happening here. They don't care about innocent lives, international law, or about UN resolutions. But when you removed the release of the hostages as a condition for a ceasefire, and I know all of you very well, you know how to read a resolution, you know the power of the language of a resolution, but when you removed the release of the hostages as a condition for a ceasefire, you gave Hamas the freedom to ignore you all and to place every bit of pressure on Israel. You handed them time, leverage, and political cover. You have told the hostage families that their loved ones are no longer a priority. Mr. President, the hostages are innocent civilians kidnapped from their homes and held in the dark tunnels of Gaza. Many have been brutally murdered. They have not seen sunlight. They have not spoken to their families. They are being denied every basic human dignity. The Palestinian prisoners are terrorists who are protected by our legal system. Many of them are murderers with blood on their hands. They are held in accordance with the law, with access to rights, food, and medical care. Now, because Israel agrees to exchanges, it doesn't mean we accept a false equivalency. It was because we place unlimited value on every life, while Hamas only values death. And I heard some of you who made that comparison to suggest that these two groups are morally equal, as this resolution seemed to. And you read the resolution again, you know the meaning of words. Putting the hostages together with the terrorists, it is not just dishonest, it is evil, it is immoral. Despite this absurd equivalence, the text still found time to lecture Israel on humanitarian aid. However, this resolution was proposed after humanitarian aid had already resumed. The new international aid mechanism developed with the US and in coordination with Israel has already become operational. That mechanism is delivering aid, but most critically, it is doing what the old system could not, stopping Hamas from stealing it. Over the past weeks, thousands of tons of aid have been distributed under the new mechanism. Alongside the new mechanism, hundreds of trucks have also been entering Gaza, carrying supplies coordinated by Israel and international partners. So I ask again, what is this Council doing by proposing this resolution now? You know, when we had the closure, I understood Slovenia, you wanted to stop it, but right after we opened the gates of Gaza, right after the new mechanism in action, now is the time to bring the resolution? This resolution doesn't advance humanitarian relief. It undermines it. It ignores a working system in favor of political agendas. It ignores the one party still endangering civilians in Gaza, Hamas, the group that hijacks trucks and stockpiles the aid to their benefit. If you really care about the people of Gaza, then stop protecting those who started this war and continue to prolong it. If you care about aid, then help ensure it reaches civilians and not terrorists. If you care about progress, then start telling the truth. Mr. President, Madam President, this resolution is not a step forward. It ignores the reality on the ground. It disregards the negotiations that are already underway. It betrays the very people it claims to protect. Israel will continue to fight for the return of our hostages. We will continue to protect our citizens. We will continue to cooperate with our partners to deliver aid to civilians. Israel will not stop. We will not rest. We will not abandon our people. We have proven time and again that military pressure works. Hostages come home not because Hamas decides to be merciful all of a sudden, but because they are forced to. And we will do whatever it takes to bring them back. You have dedicated all of your energy and efforts in drafting this resolution, negotiating on it, putting it to a vote. Now it will pass next week to the General Assembly for another vote. But colleagues, I must be very honest with you. Don't waste more of your energy. Don't waste more of your time, because no resolution, no vote, no moral failure will stand in our way. We will bring them home, all of them.
I thank the representative of Israel for his statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Yemen.
Madam President, I have the honor to deliver this statement on behalf of the Arab Group. At the outset, we congratulate you, Madam President, on your presidency of the Security Council for this month. We thank you for responding to the request to convene this meeting to consider the draft resolution submitted by the 10 elected members of the Security Council on the deteriorating humanitarian situation in the Gaza Strip. The Arab group expresses its deep regret that the Security Council was unable to adopt the draft resolution submitted by the elected members. This comes despite the urgent humanitarian demands it contains. It calls for an immediate, unconditional and permanent ceasefire in the Gaza Strip, the immediate and unconditional release of all hostages, and demands the lifting of the blockade and all restrictions on the entry and distribution of humanitarian aid into Gaza in an unhindered manner and at scale. In addition, it calls for the restoration of essential services in line with international humanitarian law and the fundamental principles of humanitarian action. These are humanity, impartiality, neutrality, and independence, in addition to relevant Security Council resolutions. The Arab group emphasizes that the Council's failure to fulfill its responsibility represents a serious undermining of its mandate to maintain international peace and security. This perpetuates an unacceptable bias that deepens the inability of this Council and the international system to stop the grave violations committed against the Palestinian people on a daily basis. In this context, the Arab group calls for intensifying action at all levels, including the UN General Assembly and international mechanisms concerned with human rights and international humanitarian law. This would ensure the provision of international protection for the Palestinian people, the cessation of the heinous Israeli aggression, and the immediate and comprehensive lifting of the siege on the Gaza Strip. It would also ensure the accountability of all those responsible for the grave crimes and violations committed by Israel, the occupying power in the Gaza Strip. The Arab group reiterates its full support for the mediation effort undertaken by the Arab Republic of Egypt, the State of Qatar, and the United States of America to achieve an immediate and lasting ceasefire, alleviate humanitarian suffering currently being experienced, resume the entry of humanitarian aid and exchange prisoners and detainees, and support all international and regional effort to achieve this goal and implement Security Council Resolution 2735. The Arab group emphasizes the need to ensure the full protection of Palestinian civilians, lift the unjust blockade imposed on the Gaza Strip, and allow the entry of humanitarian aid without any restrictions or conditions to all parts of the Gaza Strip. It emphasizes that the continued denial of access to relief supplies and the targeting of civilians and civilian infrastructure constitute flagrant violations of international law and international humanitarian law. This requires a firm stance by the international community and this Council to put an end to these violations and hold the perpetrators accountable. The Arab group condemns in the strongest terms the continued brutal Israeli aggression against the Gaza Strip for over 600 days. This aggression takes a systematic form of barbaric bombing, destruction, and starvation. Since the imposition of the full blockade in March of this year, the occupying power has prevented the entry of food, water, medicine, and fuel into the Gaza Strip. This resulted in a complete paralysis of all aspects of life in the Strip. Hunger levels have reached what the United Nations described as unprecedented in the world. The entire population of Gaza is at the risk of starvation. The UN Secretary General warned that this blockade constitutes unacceptable collective punishment, which necessitates urgent international action to put an end to these gross violations of international humanitarian law. Madam President, humanitarian aid has been transformed into a means of forced displacement, as civilians, including women and children, are forced to repeatedly be displaced to distribution points that are managed within the occupation system and lack the minimum level of human security and dignity. International reports and television lenses have documented incidents of shooting at civilians as they gathered to receive aid. This resulted in dozens of civilian victims, including women and children, either killed or wounded. In light of these practices, starvation is no longer just a physical violation. Instead, it has become a tool of war that is systematically and openly used in flagrant violation of international humanitarian law and the Geneva Convention's provisions, without the perpetrator facing any deterrent or accountability. The continuation of this catastrophic situation in the Gaza Strip represents an abject failure to uphold the purposes and principles of the UN Charter. It is an unacceptable failure to fulfill the collective obligation to protect civilians in armed conflict. Thus, the Arab group calls for an immediate and unconditional lifting of the unjust blockade imposed on the Gaza Strip, facilitating the entry of humanitarian aid through a UN mechanism, and opening an international, independent and transparent investigation into all violations committed. The UN Security Council is now obliged to take firm and effective measures to end this inhumane and unprecedented ordeal. Silence is no longer an option. Continued inaction is an open complicity in crime. The Arab group affirms that achieving a just and comprehensive peace in the region will not be possible without ending the Israeli occupation of all occupied Palestinian and Arab territories, including East Jerusalem. The group reiterates its commitment to the Arab Peace Initiative and the relevant resolutions of international legitimacy as the basis for resolving the conflict. It emphasizes in this context the need to establish a sovereign Palestinian state on the lines of 4th of June of 1967, with East Jerusalem as its capital, as an indispensable condition for achieving regional and international security and stability. Madam President, the Arab group condemns in the strongest terms the Israeli occupation authorities' decision to prevent the foreign ministers of a number of Arab and Islamic countries from entering the occupied Palestinian territories on the 30th of May 2025 in flagrant violation of diplomatic norms, the provisions of the Vienna Convention, and the legal obligations of the occupying power under international law. The group considers this behavior a deliberate disruption of diplomatic and political effort aimed at ending the aggression against the Palestinian people, and a persistent attempt to undermine any serious effort to achieve truce. The Arab group expresses its grave concern over the continued illegal settlement policies pursued by the occupation authorities, including the recent announcement of the construction of 22 new settlements in the occupied West Bank, in flagrant violation of international law and Security Council resolutions, foremost Resolution 2334 of 2016. The group emphasizes that these practices directly undermine the prospects of a two-state solution, pose a serious threat to regional stability and security, and undermine the prospects for a just and comprehensive settlement of the conflict. The Arab group also warns of the seriousness of the inflammatory and extortionist statements issued by some senior officials in the Israeli government, which reflect premeditated intentions to perpetuate the occupation, expand settlements, and impose a unilateral reality by force, including forcibly displacing people from their lands. The group emphasizes that these statements and practices seriously undermine the chances of reaching a just and comprehensive political solution based on international legitimacy resolutions. To conclude, the Arab group reiterates its unwavering commitment to the inalienable right of the Palestinian people to self-determination and to the independence of their sovereign state established on their land with East Jerusalem as its capital. It calls on the Security Council to assume its full responsibility, stand up for the justice of the Palestinian cause, and take the necessary effective measures to address the grave violations and crimes committed against Palestinian civilians. The Council must ensure accountability and avoid impunity to uphold the principles of international law and enhance the chances of achieving a just and lasting peace in the region. Thank you, Madam President.
I thank the representative of Yemen for his statement. There are no more names inscribed on the list of speakers. The meeting is adjourned.
Tyler Hessel.